The text came in at 6:47 on a Wednesday morning while I was elbow deep in a quarterly audit at my desk. 32 years as a forensic accountant will do that to you. I've always been an early riser, always had numbers in front of me before the coffee finished brewing. My phone buzzed against the desk and I almost ignored it. Almost. It was my old friend Hector. We'd worked together briefly in the late 90s before he moved to Tampa. His wife, Patsy, had been my wife's closest friend from their church group, back when things like church groups still mattered to me. Gordon, I need you to call me when you get a chance. It's about Diane. Just like that. No explanation, no emoji, no hope you're doing well. Hector had never texted me out of the blue in the 20-something years since he left Ohio. I stared at the screen for a moment, then picked up the phone and called him. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been holding the phone. I've been going back and forth for 3 weeks about whether to do this, he said. Patsy still doesn't know I'm calling you. Hector, what's going on? There was a long exhale. When's the last time you looked at your joint accounts, Gordon? The ones Diane manages. I leaned back in my chair. My wife managed our household finances. Always had. It made sense. I handled the professional numbers. She handled the domestic side. That was the arrangement we'd settled into somewhere around year 8 of our marriage, and I'd never had a reason to question it. Diane was organized, careful, responsible. She had a spreadsheet for everything. I don't know. A few months ago. Why? There's a man, Hector said. A younger man. He's been coming to your house in Westerville on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons for the better part of a year. Patsy noticed him last November. She didn't say anything to me until December. I didn't say anything to you until now. He stopped. I'm saying something now. The room got very still. Are you sure it's the same man? Same car every time. Dark green Jeep Cherokee, Ohio plates. He parks in your driveway, Gordon, not down the street. In your driveway. And last month, Patsy saw Diane kiss him at the front door. A real kiss, not a neighborly one. I looked at the spreadsheet on my screen. 27 years of numbers, patterns, anomalies, discrepancies. 32 years of training myself to follow a thread wherever it led. Thank you for telling me, Hector. You're not angry at me? No, I'm not angry at you. What I felt wasn't anger. It was something colder, something methodical. The part of my brain that reads ledgers for a living had already begun to stir. I hung up and sat there for probably 4 minutes, which is longer than it sounds when your whole marriage is rearranging itself inside your chest. Then I opened our joint checking account online. I'd expected to find something off. I hadn't expected to find what I found. The account was fine on the surface. Mortgage, utilities, groceries, the usual. But there was a second savings account I'd forgotten we'd opened years ago, a rainy day fund Diane had set up. I hadn't looked at it in probably 5 years. I hadn't needed to. I trusted her. The balance was $847. 3 years ago, that account had held $62,000. I poured myself a cup of coffee, though I didn't drink it, and I started going back through every statement I could access online, month by month. The withdrawals were elegant. $1,800 here, $2,400 there, never round numbers, never large enough to trigger automatic alerts, spread across a calendar year the way an experienced person would do it. Someone who understood how not to be noticed. It took me until noon to map the full picture. Slightly over $58,000, transferred or withdrawn over 31 months, in amounts small enough to stay invisible. She'd been bleeding the account dry since the spring of the year my mother died. I am 63 years old. I have 2 daughters. My younger one, Kay, lives in Columbus, 20 minutes from us. My older one, Fern, is in Portland with her husband and my 2 grandkids. My wife and I had built a life in a brick colonial in Westerville that we'd moved into when Kay was still in diapers. We had a dog for 16 years. We drove sensible cars. We went to door decoration contests at the neighborhood association. We were, by every visible measure, the boring, solid kind of married that people mean when they say they seem so happy. I spent the afternoon doing what I'd trained myself to do in the face of an irregular finding. I gathered everything before I moved. I called my attorney, a man named Aldous Vane, who I'd known since a professional referral about 8 years back. Aldous is not a warm man. He is, however, thorough and relentless and not given to panic, which is exactly what I needed. Tell me this is about a business matter, he said when I explained. I wish it were. Walk me through the numbers. I walked him through everything. The account drainage, the timeline, the methodology. He was quiet for a long time. You've built a partial case already, he said. You know that. I know. What don't you know? who the man is, what she's planning to do with the money, whether there's more I haven't found yet. Start with the accounts you don't manage. Retirement, annuities, any investment vehicles in her name or jointly held. I'll need a forensic auditor. You are a forensic auditor. I'll need one who isn't me. He made some calls. By the next morning, I had a woman named Cecily Park on the case. Former IRS investigator, specialized in matrimonial financial fraud. She was thorough and dry, and she never once looked at me with pity, which I appreciated more than I can explain. That same evening, I went home. This is the part I've had trouble explaining to people when I tell this story. Going home knowing what I knew. Watching Diane set dinner on the table, she'd made that chicken piccata I'd always liked, and listening to her talk about the book she was reading for her Thursday club, and the funny thing the neighbor's kid did at the bus stop. She was cheerful, relaxed. She poured me a glass of wine and clinked hers against it, and smiled at me the way she had for 27 years. I smiled back and ate my dinner. She didn't know I knew, and I needed to keep it that way. The next 2 weeks were the strangest of my life. I'd spent my career investigating deception from a professional distance. Numbers don't have a face you have to look at across the dinner table. Numbers don't reach over and squeeze your hand when they notice you seem tired. Cecily came back to me on a Thursday with the full picture. The retirement accounts had not been touched. They were structured in a way that would have required my signature for any movement, and apparently Diane hadn't been willing to attempt that. But she had, 18 months earlier, taken out a home equity line of credit on our house. Our house. My name was on the deed. So was hers. The application had been processed through a lender we'd never used, submitted electronically. My signature appeared on the documents. I'd signed nothing. I'd known nothing. I sat in Cecily's office looking at the papers for a long time. How much did she draw down? I asked. 80,000. Paid out in 2 disbursements over 6 months. The line is still open. She could draw more. The balance of credit available is 43,000. I looked out the window at the parking lot. A man was carrying his dry cleaning. An ordinary Wednesday, $80,000. 58,000 from savings. In my profession, we call this a pattern of concealment. In a marriage, you call it something else. There's one more thing, Cecily said. She set another document on the table. She refinanced a life insurance policy on you. 5 years ago, your policy was rewritten, and the coverage increased from 1 million to 3 million. The beneficiary is solely your wife. No contingent beneficiaries. Your daughters aren't on it. The original policy had listed our daughters as contingent beneficiaries. Standard estate planning. I'd set it up that way deliberately years ago because I wanted to make sure Fern and Kay were protected regardless of what happened. Someone had removed them. Is the change in her handwriting? Cecily shook her head. It's in yours, or something close enough to pass. I called Aldous from the parking lot. I sat in my car for 11 minutes before I could speak clearly. She forged my signature on the insurance modification, I said. Silence on his end. Gordon, you understand that changes the nature of what we're looking at. I understand. This isn't just financial misconduct. If someone has increased a life insurance payout and forged your name to make you the sole source of that payout, and if that someone has been systematically moving assets out of your joint holdings, I know what it looks like. We need to bring in a private investigator. And we may need to loop in law enforcement. Not yet. I need to know who this man is first. I need to understand the full structure before I move. Aldous didn't like it. He said so twice. But he understood, because in 30 years of legal work, he'd seen what happens when people act on incomplete information. Charges that don't stick, cases that fall apart, guilty parties who walk because the evidence was rushed. I hired a private investigator named Declan Marsh. Former Columbus PD detective, 17 years on the job before he went private. He was compact and quiet and had the kind of face that blended into any room. I gave him everything, the man's car, the Tuesday-Thursday schedule, the home address. By the following Friday, Declan had a name, Jasper Holloway, 31 years old, personal financial advisor at a boutique firm in Dublin, Ohio. That's a suburb north of Columbus. Nice area, a lot of corporate money moving around. Jasper had met my wife 14 months ago at a financial wellness seminar she'd attended through her book club. He'd given her his card. He had a record which the investment firm didn't seem to know about, or chose not to investigate closely. A civil judgment from 7 years ago for deceptive practices in a real estate transaction. a dismissed criminal complaint from a former client who'd alleged unauthorized transfers from her accounts. The pattern was not new. "He's a predator," Declan said, matter-of-factly, the way you'd note a water stain on a ceiling. "He finds women in certain life stages, vulnerable, underappreciated, significant assets, and he helps them make financial decisions they later regret. Or in some cases, he makes the decisions for them." "Do you think she knows what he's done before?" "Hard to say. She may know and not care. She may think she's different. They always think they're different. What's the money for? Where did the 80,000 go?" "A joint account," Declan said. "In Florida, Bradenton specifically. Opened 11 months ago, both names on it." My wife and a 31-year-old man I'd never met had a joint bank account in Bradenton, Florida. I thought about what I'd said to Aldous. I need to understand the full structure. I understood it now. Declan gave me one more piece of information, almost as an afterthought. "There's a condo," he said, "in Bradenton, listed in her name, purchased 8 months ago. Cash transaction, $82,000. There it was. The money hadn't been spent. It had been moved. Slowly, carefully, invisibly. Pulled from our life together and relocated to a place I'd never known about, in a state I didn't live in, under her name only, with a man half her age who had a documented history of targeting women with assets. She was building an exit. She just wasn't planning to let me keep living while she exited. That's when I stopped thinking of it as a financial investigation. I told Aldous. I told him everything. The condo, the joint account, the insurance policy, the forged signature. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I'm calling a detective I know at the Franklin County Sheriff's Office. Tonight? Give me 1 week first. Gordon. I have a plan. I need 1 week." What I needed was evidence of intent. The financial trail was damning, but it was also ambiguous. A good defense attorney could argue an unhappy spouse preparing for divorce. Nothing criminal about that. The insurance forgery is a separate matter. The husband was controlling. She feared him. It goes on and on. I'd seen those arguments work. I'd seen them work in fraud cases, in embezzlement trials, in civil proceedings. Juries are human beings, and human beings want a narrative that makes sense. I needed their narrative, on record, in their own words. My daughter Kay came over for dinner on a Saturday, and I almost told her. She'd always been perceptive, even as a kid. She sat across from her mother, and I watched her, looking for any sign that she noticed something different, something off. She didn't. Diane was impeccable. She laughed. She was warm. She talked about wanting to visit Fern in Portland in the spring. I said nothing. It wasn't time. I set up a meeting with my accountant, a man I'd known for 15 years named Otto Briggs, and I quietly restructured what I could in the time I had. The retirement accounts, my own individual investments. I didn't touch the joint accounts. I didn't want to spook her, but I made sure the things that were solely mine were protected. I also quietly had my estate attorney revise my will. If something happened to me, my daughters would be provided for through a trust that didn't pass through my wife's hands. That felt like the darkest afternoon of the year. Sitting in a lawyer's office at 63, redrafting my will because I was genuinely uncertain whether my wife wanted me dead. Declan had set up a surveillance on Jasper Holloway's apartment, a high-rise unit in the Short North neighborhood in Columbus. On the Wednesday of my second week of knowing, he called me. "She's there," he said. "She told you book club?" Book club meets on Thursdays. She said she was picking up something for Kai. She's been inside for 2 hours. I've got photos. The following Tuesday, I did something that I am still not entirely certain was the right call, but I don't regret it. I called in sick to the office, something I had not done in 4 years, and I drove to Jasper Holloway's building, and I waited in a coffee shop across the street with a clear view of the entrance. My wife arrived at 1:15. She was wearing a coat I'd bought her for our 25th anniversary. She went inside. I did not go in after her. That was not the point. The point was that I needed to see it with my own eyes, not on a report, not in a photograph. I needed to know the gap between what I'd believed about my life and what my life actually was. She came out at 4:20. She was on her phone, smiling at something on the screen. She looked, and I say this as plainly as I can, she looked happy. Easy in herself in a way I hadn't seen in years without knowing why I was noticing it. She drove home. I sat in the coffee shop for another 20 minutes, drank a second cup I didn't taste, and then I drove home too. That night, after dinner, I asked her something I'd been turning over in my mind for days. "Are you happy, Diane? I mean it. With us." She looked up from her book. She didn't hesitate. "Of course I am. Why do you ask something like that?" I don't know. I've been reflective lately. Getting older, I suppose. I wonder sometimes if I've been present enough. Whether you've felt alone. She put the book down and looked at me with an expression I now understand was one of the most accomplished performances I have ever witnessed. You've been a wonderful husband, Gordon. We've built a wonderful life. I wouldn't trade it. She went back to her book. I looked at her for a moment, this woman I'd loved for 27 years, who I'd trusted with the architecture of our daily lives, and I felt something calcify inside me, not hatred, something quieter than that, something that looked, I think, like clarity. The next morning I called Aldous and gave him the go-ahead. He contacted his connection at the Franklin County Sheriff's Office, a detective named Quinlan, who passed it immediately to the Financial Crimes Unit. The forged insurance documents alone were enough to open an investigation. The HELOC forgery compounded it. When they pulled Jasper Holloway's financial records and found the joint account in Florida and the Bradenton property purchased in my wife's name with funds that had been removed from our joint accounts, through what appeared to be a systematic scheme, the case expanded quickly. Declan had, over his weeks of surveillance, recorded 2 conversations between my wife and Jasper outside his building, both captured legally, both damaging. In one, she'd said, "We just need to be patient. Once the estate is settled, we're untouchable." In another, Jasper had said, "I've done this before. The key is not moving too fast. I've done this before. The key is not moving too fast." That sentence did something to my thinking that I still haven't fully worked through. It made my wife a victim, in a certain sense, even as she was also plainly a perpetrator. She had been seduced. Not romantically at first, I suspect, but financially. A man who understood how to find a woman who felt invisible in her marriage, and show her a door to somewhere else. He'd done it before. She'd opened the door herself, willingly, but she'd been shown it by someone who made a profession of showing that door to women in her exact position. I don't say this to excuse her. She forged my name. She removed my daughters from their father's estate plan. Whatever vulnerability Jasper Holloway exploited, she still made a sequence of choices that could have ended my life. The detectives built the case over 6 weeks. They came to me twice during that period to ask questions, to show me documents, to have me formally identify signatures as forgeries. I went to work every day. I came home every evening. I had dinner with my wife, and I listened to her talk, and I said nothing. The morning they made the arrests, I was in Aldous' office. I'd known it was coming. They'd given me that much, out of courtesy. My wife was arrested at home at 8:15 in the morning. Jasper Holloway was arrested at his office in Dublin at 8:30. Declan texted me when both were confirmed. I sat in Aldous' office and looked out the window at the January skyline and tried to feel something clean. I couldn't, quite. What I felt was exhausted and correct, if that makes sense. The way you feel after you've spent 16 hours tracking a discrepancy and you finally find it buried in a footnote. Not triumphant, just finished. My daughter Kay called me at 9 like, "Dad." Her voice was tight. "There are police at the house." "Moms," they said, "she's been arrested." "Dad, what is happening?" "I need you to come to my attorney's office," I said. "I'll explain everything." I did explain everything. Kay cried for about 40 minutes, and then she asked a series of very precise questions, which is a thing she does, and has always done, when she's processing something painful. Fern flew in from Portland 3 days later. The conversation with Fern was different, harder in some ways, because Fern was further from the daily reality of it, and the shock landed differently at a distance. Neither of my daughters knew. I want to be clear about that. Whatever their mother had done, they had not known, and they were not served well by anyone who assumed otherwise. The case moved faster than I expected. Jasper Holloway had, in fact, done this before. Twice, it emerged, with other women in other states. The Financial Crimes Unit shared information with investigators in Georgia and Indiana, where civil judgments against him had never quite escalated to criminal charges. This time they did. He had no meaningful defense. He pleaded out to avoid federal charges and received 7 years. He'll be 40 before he's out. His name will be on a financial fraud registry that will follow him for the rest of his professional life. My wife fought the case harder. Her attorney was aggressive, and the first 2 hearings were unpleasant to sit through. But the recordings Declan had made, combined with the paper trail Cecily had documented, and the forensic analysis of the signature forgeries, didn't leave much room for an alternative narrative. At a certain point, her attorney advised her to plead. She received 5 years on the financial fraud charges, with additional time for the forgery. The insurance scheme added a conspiracy element that the prosecutor pressed hard, and rightly so. Our daughters were not in court for the sentencing. I asked them to stay away, and they did. Hector and Patsy drove up from Tampa for it. They sat 2 rows behind me, and when it was over, Patsy came and put her hand on my shoulder and didn't say anything, which was the right thing to do. Afterward, in the parking lot, Hector shook his head slowly. "I almost didn't text you," he said. "I almost let it go, I know." Patsy kept saying it wasn't our place. But I thought about how I'd want someone to tell me. "You did the right thing," I said. "Whatever the right thing costs, you did it anyway." He nodded. He looked uncomfortable with the gratitude, which is why I've always respected him. I sold the house in Westerville 6 months after the sentencing. Too much history in every corner of it, and not all the history was bad. That was the problem. The kitchen where we'd made Thanksgiving dinner for 23 years, the backyard where I'd taught Kay to throw a softball. Some of the ghosts in that house were good ones, and I couldn't figure out how to live with the good ones and the bad ones both. I bought a smaller place, a townhouse in Grandview Heights, closer to downtown, closer to Kay. I got a dog, a 3-year-old shelter mutt, named something unimpressive that he'd had at the shelter, which I kept because he'd already learned it, and I didn't see the point in confusing him. He sleeps at the foot of my bed. I still do forensic accounting, though I've cut back to part-time consulting. There's something clarifying about the work, especially now. Numbers don't deceive you in the ways that matter. They conceal things, yes. That's the whole point of the cases I work. But they conceal things according to patterns, and patterns can be found if you're willing to look carefully and follow the thread without flinching. My wife wrote to me once, from the facility where she's serving her sentence. I didn't read the letter past the first paragraph. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it as a simple fact about where I am. Some bridges are gone, not in anger, just in structural reality. You cannot put weight on something that no longer exists. What I think about now, more than the courtroom or the forensic documents or the night I sat in a coffee shop watching my wife walk out of another man's building, is the text from Hector. It's about Diane. 4 words from a man I hadn't spoken to in 2 years, sent because he'd thought about how he'd want someone to tell him. People talk about betrayal as though it comes in one form, from one direction. It doesn't. Betrayal can come from the person you sleep beside, but decency can come from somewhere just as unexpected. An old friend in Tampa, his wife watching from a neighbor's window, choosing to say the uncomfortable thing because the alternative was silence, and silence, in their experience, had cost too much. I am 63 years old, and I am starting over in a townhouse in Grandview Heights, with an unimaginatively named dog, and a part-time consulting practice, and 2 daughters who call me most Sundays. It is not the life I planned. It is not the life I would have chosen if you'd asked me at 35 what 63 was supposed to look like. But I'm here, clear-eyed and solvent, and, on most mornings, something close to grateful. If you're reading this and something in your gut has been telling you that numbers don't add up, that schedules don't quite fit, that someone around you knows something they're not saying, listen to that. Pursue it calmly, carefully, completely. Get good people around you. Don't act until you understand the full picture. And if you're the Hector in someone else's story, the one who knows something, who's been going back and forth for 3 weeks about whether it's your place to say it, say it. Say it anyway. You may not know how much it matters until years later, and by then you won't need to, because the person you told it to will already know.